Hello, viewers. Welcome to the guest hour. You can imagine that since 1990s, the rise of digital platform, the age of globalization, age of information, brought up many narratives, especially with reference to the notions like clash of civilization, where fears around the geopolitics of emotions talked about hope, fears, and humiliation. Today, we are honored to have a guest who comes all the way from Toronto, Canada, and she'll be talking more about these specific thoughts, especially with reference to the role of intercultural media communications, that how these notions of fears can be used as a notions of hope and bridge between the societies. So let me introduce today's our guest, Miss Narmeen Lakhani. Welcome to the show. She's actually has a very depth of knowledge and, of course, expertise working practically and, of course, with her relations within academia as well. She's educational media producer, and she specializes in inclusive storytelling, more specific to the Muslim society's representation in the media platforms. So it's an honor. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So we would love to hear about your work. What do you do? What organization do you have it, and what contribution it has to the societies? And then what inspires you to come to GB, and then how it relates to GB, and how do you make GB going worldwide as well?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Tasawar, and to KIU for having me. Um, I think this is my second time in GB, so I was here last year for a very brief visit, and of course, I think Gilgit-Baltistan has this effect on anyone who visits that the mountains, the society, the hospitality of people sort of always brings you back, and I decided that I wanted to come here for a bit longer and sort of immerse myself more, travel across the different regions, explore different cultures and all of that. But I'll take you, a few years behind my journey to understand what really brought me here. And I guess like many Muslims, whether they realize it or not, I think, in some respects, all of our journey as Muslim storytellers began around 9/11. For me, at that time, I was in grade 9 and I grew up in the US, so the deep American South. And I think that event really changed my life in some respects. And I think whether even the next generation realizes it or not, I think all of us are impacted in some way or the other. So when 9/11 happened, it was, I think, in the morning during a school day. And suddenly the next day, I went down as usual to our cafeteria to have lunch with my classmates, and my friends who I see every day stopped me and said, "Wait, where are you from?" and wanted to ask all these questions about me before I was allowed to have lunch with them. And I think that's when it really hit me, the magnitude of how people's perception of someone can change so quickly. So someone, my family originally migrated to Pakistan after the partition. So if we think about any society in which we have our neighbors and our friends and our community members, and we all live in harmony, but then all of a sudden, if media and political voices and a number of external factors have the ability to shake us so much that we question and challenge the very people you have meals with, just one day prior, then I think to me it really provoked this idea that storytelling and media are very powerful tools. And, how do I use them? If they can be used to divide people, I have conviction that they can be also used to unite people. And I think from that point on, that has been my mission, my life's mission in my work, is to look at how do we use storytelling as a way to build bridges and more inclusively represent different communities and societies. Of course, because my personal experience is as a Muslim, and again, that is only one story. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world, so I can only represent myself. Um, you know, but I think the basic premise or principle of pluralism applies to everybody. Um, so after 9/11, of course, going for higher education and studies, my graduate research became focused on the representation of Muslims in media. And what I realized was that it wasn't sufficient to try to convince adults through journalism, to challenge their perspectives. So I went further into children's media because I think at the young age, kids are much more receptive and adaptive to the societies around them and embracing different cultures and traditions. So I started my own recently, earlier this year, I started my own educational media platform called Birdwings Media, which is meant to celebrate the contributions of Muslims to society, to explore the diversity of narratives within the Muslim world. I think one of the biggest, reasons behind Islamophobia is that there's been, often a very singular, monolithic portrayal of all Muslims in media. And of course, you and I do not even have the same story. We come from different parts of the world. We speak different languages. We eat different foods. We listen to different music. So if 2 people cannot have the same story, how can 2 billion people have the same story? And so I decided in this endeavor, ideally, I would love to travel, across many countries where people identify as Muslim. But because I was born in Pakistan, I felt that it was sort of a great starting point for me to return here. And before I can try to convince other people about their identities, it's important for me to relearn my own identity as well. And so I began traveling across Pakistan at the beginning of this year and sort of documenting stories that I find and everyday stories. I think the idea for me was to normalize the Muslim experience. And so, let's say recently I went to a small village of Chuperson near the Afghan border where I was just, hanging out with a bunch of kids who are playing polo. And they're teaching me how to play polo. They've invented this new version of polo because they don't have horses. So they created these, metal cycles that they play with. And it was just an everyday story about kids having fun that for me, I hope, to my audiences, demystifies the idea that, the Muslim world and the different contexts in which they live are oppressive or uncivilized or barbaric in some way. There's rich history and culture to be explored. And I think as much as I'm documenting that for other audiences, I am also learning and challenging my own biases about the Muslim world.
Thank you. Very exciting. And welcome to your roots as well. I mean, the way you project very positively the image of the society. Since the recipe and menu of your dish is very much colorful and very, it looks like very delicious. So let's segregate into certain components. To begin with, I think we can start some of your perspective on the notions of social media. More specifically, when we see the rise of digital platforms, social media is currently playing a very pivotal role, and where it comes down to the ethical and responsible reflection and storytelling in an inclusive manner. So how do you see the role of social media in terms of this ethical and responsible storytelling, where it comes down to the individual identity, then collectively a community identity, and then what role it plays in the local at the global scale when there's a connection is getting more deeper and deeper, the way the landscape of the world has been changing eventually. So,
yeah, I think, social media comes with a lot of advantages and disadvantages. And I think one of the pros of social media, the advent of social media, is that anyone has access to storytelling, to telling stories and consuming stories from anywhere in the world. I think before, like I have the privilege right now of being able to travel and go to grassroots communities and build relationships and learn people's stories one-on-one. But I think the digital realm allows us to do that at a much larger scale with minimal resources. I think it also sort of mitigates traditional gatekeepers. So where traditional media institutions, have systems in place that are hard to change overnight, I think social media really democratizes storytelling and allows everybody's voices to be heard. I think the flip side of that is that the algorithms and ways social media is designed can also be very dangerous because they feed our own ideology. I think in any society, it is really important to hear perspectives that are different from our own. We cannot grow in society. We cannot, empathize with each other if we refuse to listen to each other. And I think social media can often be an echo chamber where whatever we believe is just multiplied more and more. And I think what, inevitably, in many ways that's done is polarized people, and it's created this mentality of us versus them, which I think is not healthy for anybody. Whereas when, and I think then you start getting into this fallacy of portraying information as black and white, X versus Y, as opposed to sometimes when I'm just out for coffee and I'll be having a discussion with someone, and then a third person joins us and says, hey, can I join your conversation? And they have a very different viewpoint. And it opens up my mind because I hear it from a real human being, and I connect with them. And I'm like, oh, I've never thought about this before. Because the way I learned that information was very linear. But as we know, no information, no story is so, I think, narrowly defined. There are many layers and complexities to everything. So often what we see on the media is very one-dimensional. Even like I'm a novel writer, and we're working, when we study novel writing, we always say even the villains should be multidimensional. We should be able to empathize with them. Everybody who has an experience, everybody is a product of the experiences they have had in their life. And we must give opportunity to hear, at the minimum, hear those experiences. The notion of pluralism, I think, is one that really resonates with me because there's this idea, as Anas Dial Khan talks about in his speech at Tutsing while receiving a Peace Prize, is that the notion that we are all fellow seekers of truth. It's not that my truth is right and yours is wrong. Subjectively, both of those truths are right from the place that they're coming from. And I think the way we move forward as society is to say, and this was actually Aristotle's notion, 1,000 years ago, of the idea of rhetoric, was the art of truth seeking. Is that let me, in this dialogue, let me tell you what my truth is. You respond with your truth. I respond further with my truth, and so on until we find a common truth, right? Something where I see my story reflected in yours and vice versa. And that is how I believe we move forward as society, and why I believe storytelling is so, important in that foundation. Because without knowing how to tell these deep-rooted stories where we can connect with somebody, I think the information we're presented with on social media is very superficial, and I think freedom of speech is a privilege, that should be exercised ethically. One of the aspects of Muslim storytelling or talking about Muslim values to people where, Islam has been so misrepresented in media is to ensure that we're working using the premise of ethics of Islam, which have always been around tolerance and dialogue and consultation and, inclusion of different cultures and traditions and celebrating that. So I think, social media can either be dehumanizing or we can be critical in how we use it, and think about at any given point, how does it represent? I think often people, one of the challenges when technology moves much faster than education systems, meaning I think most people today might know how to use a smartphone, but have not studied media literacy. So I think we all are very quickly, we hit the like button, we hit the share, retweet, post the filters on Instagram, whatever it is, without thinking, really. I think, sometimes so paranoid because I've studied the implications of media for so many years that before I put anything out there, I think about, well, how does it represent me? Not only me, how does it represent my family? How does it represent my community? How does it represent women? How does it represent Canadians, Pakistanis, any other identity that to which I'm connected? Because I don't think that, often when we speak, it's usually people don't receive it as this is this individual's opinion. It's always within the context of something bigger. And I think we have to reflect on that before we put information out there, and how we brand ourselves. So I think the question to ask everybody who engages on social media now is, do we think about our accountability to ourselves, to the communities we represent, and then to the next generation? What is the role model or the kind of aspiration that we're setting for the next generation in what we put out there?
Very thought-provoking. Before we heading toward this next generation or the young generations, naturally we all, putting on your this notions of fellow of seekers of the truth. I just recall one of the book of Joseph Stiglitz, who Oslo greatly criticized the globalization and its perspectives, especially one of his recent work on making globalization work, where he said there's always a dearth of democratic traditions in the globalization. This inclusivity notion has been missing in the globalization. So building on those notions, how do you see the democratizing of storytelling? Especially, we also vividly experienced during the COVID-19, it also reflected number of digital divides in the societies. To mend these divides, of course, these notions are very important to build on the narratives and intercultural communication. But where do you see these notions of coming up as a democratizing of storytelling? How these filters can contribute in terms of responsibility and accountability of this narrative building, please?
I always I have this sort of phrase in the back of my mind that I anchor myself in my work, which is that be compassionate toward people, but hold systems accountable. So when I work with, human beings one-on-one, no matter how much they disagree with me or have a certain mindset about me, my intention, or even if I have to work really hard at the beginning of the day to say that, to ask for compassion in my work, I try to push myself to do that with other people. But when it comes to broader systems that we're trying to change, institutionalized systems, education systems, curriculum, media systems, things like that, these massive institutions that have hundreds of years of history and are very sort of, set in stone, and it's hard to move them. I think with systems, I try to be accountable, hold them accountable, to say that, so I will go meet with different leadership. I have met with a lot of media leadership. I have at least 40 meetings a year as advocacy. I sit on, advisory committees of education institutions that teach media and storytelling. I sit with organizations in children's publishing, So I think there's realms, circles of dialogue of how you're going to affect change. I think everybody at an individual level has the opportunity, first of all, to be ambassadorial. If we cannot do anything else about changing the environment around us, certainly we can control the narratives we are portraying, right? And how critical we are being of ourselves, how we are challenging our own biases before we can do that for anybody else. Often I learned in a social justice workshop once that sometimes we all get stuck operating in these paradoxes, that we are ready to, sort of seek justice for ourselves and say, this is wrong, somebody has done this wrong toward us. But do we offer that same justice to other people? So I think that is part of our ethics also, is that what we ask for ourselves, we must also be willing to do for other people. And I think that only furthers our work. So I think we have to show up for other communities as well. So if I am sort of advocating for Muslim representation in media, I have to make an equal effort to hear other communities. So, for example, I'm learning a lot about Indigenous communities in Canada who have been underrepresented and misrepresented for many years in media and storytelling. And so I'm equally trying to learn about other communities that I don't understand. And then it becomes this beautiful dialogue where I'm learning about them and they're learning about me. And I would say that the same goes for being in GB. Sometimes it's very challenging for me to sit in new communities and absorb ideas and things like that. But there are many wonderful things that come out of that, learning each other's culture. So one of the things is, people often ask me, well, what is the biggest difference, between living in Canada and currently living in GB? And I would say is that in the West, we're often very pressed for time. I'm always looking at my watch. We're always running. Everything is very scheduled, calculated. I have no idea who my neighbors are. And here, we're often sitting for tea. A neighbor will casually pop by and join us. And it's lovely. It's lovely to have the sense of community that looks after you and is interested in knowing who you are and sharing food with you and all of these things. And if I'm not feeling well, everybody comes around to support me. So I think, the responsibility starts with us as individuals.
Sure.
To, I think there's, Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability. I think in some respects, and social media propagates all these filters. We're all walking around, and Shakespeare said this, right? Like we're all walking around as actors wearing a mask. And I think when we are willing to, I've experienced this, when I am willing to take off my mask and expose my vulnerabilities as a human being, then the person across from me, no matter how different the context is from which they belong, they do the same, and we're able to connect at this higher level.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for very thorough insights. Keeping these notions of vulnerability and sensitivities which we are exposed, especially in this age of connectivity. And of course, we see, I'll just seek your input on the younger generation, especially when we see that the segregation of populations, muchly defined as an X, Y, Z, and Alpha generations. And more the older generation, our thoughts has been very much fortified in terms of to build these notions of learn, unlearn, and relearn phenomena. Through these narratives, what role do you see for our youngsters? And then where do you see the role of children media in education and academia? Or what significance do you see into this aspect of study?
I would say communication is really important. I've learned this in my own family and in my own culture, South Asian cultures. I think often we struggle with communication, whether it's with our parents or siblings or friends or anybody, about being honest. Right? So often people, a simple question, I think Omid Safi talks about this, that in English we say, how are you? In Urdu it's kya aapka kya haal hai? And I think even the term hal has a very deep-rooted meaning, like what is the state of your heart right now? And I think we've distilled our conversations and our communication in society now to be so minimal and so dismissive. So usually the conversations I have will be, oh, how are you? yeah, I'm good, just busy with work, and that's it. Rather than saying, how are you? Oh, you know what? I've had a really hard day today. I had this and that. And then, someone being actually honest about it. You know what? I just lost my job. Um, so everybody is very afraid to expose their weaknesses. I think the way this society is set up. And I think you can see that on our profiles. It looks like, the mental health crisis is growing significantly because of this. And not only are we doing this in person, communicating this, that when someone asks or when we talk to each other, I don't think we actually get to deeper levels of our pain or sorrows or even joy expressing, like some little things that might made me really happy. Like, sometimes I'll go out and there'll be a stranger, like a very old woman in Hunza, who every day sees me and just gives me so many blessings and prayers. And it just makes my day. And I want to share it with everybody. But in the back of my mind, I think, oh, what is someone going to say? They're like, how are you? And I'm like, oh, this lady just gave me these wonderful prayers. So I think we always keep our conversations minimal. And then to add to that, the way we show ourselves online is even worse, because we always just paint a very happy picture about our lives and look where I am and, look what I'm eating and things like that. And so I think everybody has false expectations of their own lives because we're not willing to be honest with each other. So I think communication is a huge aspect, and honest communication, vulnerability is a big aspect to build bridges across people, across generations. I think this notion of multi-generational, I think, divide in GB, but in many cultures, it's happening everywhere now, where the younger generation, because of their access to media, their viewpoints are completely different now from their parents and grandparents. And so I think understanding each other is going to require communication. But further than that, I would say even before communication is intention. What is the intention we are setting when we encounter anyone who is different from us? And I think that goes back to the notion of truth seeking. Is that if our intention is to help someone or get closer to our family members or share our sorrows or anything like that, then I think that's what we will achieve. But I think when our intentions are to harm, then that's what we'll achieve. Intentions are a very powerful notion, especially in the Islamic context. So I don't know if that answered your question or going in that.
Sure. And I just, if you can add a few more on the children media.
I think for me, youth are really where I invest a lot of my energy, because I think it's a preventive measure. Often a lot of the other work we do is reactive. We're trying to put out the fires that have already been created for the last 30, 50 years, right? The Islamophobia started before 9/11, but let's say if it really, exacerbated from 9/11, then for the last 20 years, I've been trying to put out a fire that's only getting bigger and bigger. But what if I repurpose that energy into planting seeds instead of putting out the fire? In the next 20 years, my hope is that those, plants will grow and they'll be nourished and there'll be shade again, rather than working on the wildfires. And I see because I work with youth, I see when I spend time with kids that the way they see the world, and I think at some point we all saw the world this way, but as we got older and older, we became more and more insular in our own beliefs. So I think in Pakistan, the children's media industry does not really exist. Of course, we have education systems and things like that. But by children's media, my work is sort of in 3 areas: in digital learning. I think instilling the use of imagination and creative expression is really going to impact how children form their identities, not only about themselves, but about each other. So one of the things I'm currently working on is a reading program in GB, and because I noticed in a lot of the homes I went to, and this is universal, not only in GB, of course, where kids would rather be on their iPads and cell phones than reading a book. But I think reading, helps develop with parents and kids, develops a lot of bonding, empathy. You read a story about something on the other side of the world, and you say, "Oh wow, I had no idea this, story existed," and it opens up your mind. And then you say, "Okay, well, how can I share my own story?" And you begin to express yourself. And I think expression helps again mitigate those risks of mental illness, right? And there's healthy outlets then to share your own story and have other people connect with it. So this is where I think, children's media for me, I hope, at least seems to be a very powerful tool for how we can improve as a society, 20, 30, 50 years from now.
Thank you. So, I mean, if you allow me to conclude with your words, the two of the phrases when you say the use of imagination is very important. And significantly, you referred that how algorithms are feeding our own ideologies. When we see around, especially the current contemporary trends, especially the populist notions, are heavily fed by the sensational news reporting and information. How this can be fixed, meant, of course, you talked about the advocacy and you were these very much perspectives starting from a different generation level. Will you be concluding it with some of the way forwards, please, for us?
Sure. I think as an academic institution that is building the next generation of media and communication professionals, I think as individuals, anyone who's watching who is active, on media, on social media, I think, beyond just accountability for ethical reporting and maintaining the integrity of storytelling, I think the other aspect of that is telling more balanced stories. There's a human psychology to always veer toward the negative. So if I'm having a bad day, there can be 100 good things that happened today, but the whole night I will be thinking about the one bad thing that happened. And I think if our media systems start mirroring that, which is often what they do, is instead of showing the 100 good things that happen in society, we focus on the one bad thing that happened, then that is what we are starting to believe about ourselves and about other people. So I think there is a responsibility in the stories we tell to tell a balance. It's not that the negative stories don't exist. In any society, there's good and bad. I think my concern with the representation of Muslims in media, and that can be said of news in general, is that we tend to kind of focus on this percent here. If there's a whole spectrum out there, we tend to focus on this negative and then extrapolate that as the norm, right? So I think we start to believe that is the 100% of the spectrum of stories out there. I think my goal is to say, yes, this, end of the spectrum exists, but then how do we fill the gap with other stories that also need to be told? There are wonderful stories I am seeing every day, about female entrepreneurs and, these young inventors and scientists and people doing amazing things that we just don't see enough on media. I think we constantly focus on everything that's bad. And I think that's harmful and toxic to our own psyche, but it's also portraying harmful images to other people about our society. So I think, we need to look at the bird's eye view. Often we're just thinking, well, I think the question, there's a song by a band that says, are we adding to the noise? So sometimes I have to think about that. Even when I receive a piece of news, before I share it further on WhatsApp or any platform, I think, what is the value I am adding by sharing this? Am I adding to the noise, or am I becoming part of the solution? And I think these are all sort of stopgaps we have to have for ourselves before we engage in digital media.
Thank you so much. We thank Narmeen for her time and, of course, valuable thoughts. And we honor your this valuable mission in terms of representing a society which has been very much undermined over the years. And of course, we wish you best. And we thank you for stopping by at Karakoram International University's this guest our show. Audience, I think we had a very depth of understanding and discussion on a very important issue area which we witness and been debated over the years, and of course for the last 2 to 3 decades. More specifically, we referred since 1990s, and more narrowly since 9/11 as well. And I think this could be resolved through the notions of evolving inclusivity, which builds around the notions of pluralism, which naturally evolve one of the fundamental human values like empathy, tolerance, compassion, and humility. And this is where we can move on a way forward to mend the gaps and thrive into a very peaceful coexistence society. So looking forward for another show. Thank you so much.